So we've reached the 19th century, and we're John Stuart Mill. Okay, this essay on liberty is a very famous essay, probably most famous for the second of its 5 sections, which is on his defense of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, that kind of thing. It's probably the most complete and thorough defense of opposition to censorship, basically. But the rest of it is of interest as well. And it's the sort of where the philosophy had gone in the 19th century, moving away from social contract theories. And he says at one point at the beginning of section 4, he actually says straight out that society is not based on a social contract, and there's no benefit to be had from he says, no good purpose is answered by inventing a contract in order to deduce social obligations from it. So the first part is where he says it's not based on a social contract, is a dismissal of people like Hobbes and Locke. And the second part, where he says no good purpose is achieved by inventing a contract, is a dismissal of Immanuel Kant's idea of that the social contract is not actual, it's hypothetical. Now we're going to get into that in a lot more detail when we talk about Rawls, because Rawls basically takes the Kantian idea of a hypothetical social contract and runs with it. But it is certainly a response to all these criticisms that we've seen from people like Filmer, that the social contract never really happened. There never really was a moment when society was based on a contract. But Mill is outright saying, no form of social contract has any point. And that sort of became the received view in the 19th and early 20th century. The social contract theory receded into the background until it was revived by Rawls. So what is Mill's theory? Well, Mill's most famous work, other than On Liberty, is called Utilitarianism. And in fact, he's the one who gave utilitarianism its name. The inventor of utilitarianism, or the first person to develop it, was a friend of Mill's father's called Jeremy Bentham. And utilitarianism, famously, is a consequentialist moral theory. That is, it says that an action or policy is right to the extent that it has good consequences. So what matters for anything you do or any policy you enact is what good effects it has. Not necessarily the intentions, but what you achieve as your end result. Now, utilitarianisms gauge how good a consequence is in terms of how much happiness it brings about. And for Bentham, happiness meant just simply pleasure. That is, the raw emotion, the raw feeling of pleasure. We all know what pleasure is. It's a feeling. There's actually a pleasure center of your brain that if you stimulate it, you experience raw pleasure. And for Bentham, the point of morality, or the point that we should be aiming for, is maximizing happiness for all affected. Now, this is not the place to go into utilitarianism, but Bentham was a social reformer. That is, he saw great injustices in English society at the time, and he attributed the injustices, or said that a symptom of the injustices was that there were wildly different laws for the rich and the poor. So, for example, rich people could get off with a fine, whereas poor people would be hanged for, sheep stealing or something like that. So he proposed that you needed a consistent theory to undergird your system of laws, and he proposed utilitarianism. It met with great criticism. Bentham actually was a successful politician, and actually he's probably most notorious now for inventing something called the panopticon, which is a prison where the guards are sort of in the center, and they are able to see everything. So he suggested that prisons would be much better run if the prisoners knew that they were being watched at all times, which sounds very sinister, but his motivation was good. He wanted to make prisons less hellish. Now, Bentham, certainly an interesting person and great influence on Mill's father, who had Mill raised according to utilitarian principles, and Mill himself was something of a prodigy. He could speak like 3 languages. He could read Latin and Greek before he was about 10. But he had something of a breakdown early in life. So it seems like it was too much for any young mind to take. However, he did write Utilitarianism, which is sort of a refinement and an alternative to Bentham's version of utilitarianism. And where Bentham simply measures pleasure as units, he actually comes up with a unit of pleasure. So you could, like temperature, you can measure how happy somebody was in the units of utils or hedons. Mill's view that he lays out in utilitarianism is a lot more subtle and sophisticated. For one thing, he says that there are 2 kinds of pleasures. There's lower pleasures, the pleasures that any animal can experience, but there's also higher pleasures, which include the pleasures of friendship and music appreciation. And he says that they're incommensurable. That is, no amount of lower pleasures is as good as any amount of higher pleasures. And also, instead of simple pleasure, it's more about happiness, where happiness is this sort of vaguer idea of a life well lived. And in general, his development of utilitarianism starts sounding a lot more like Aristotle's theory. But it is still very much consequentialist. And you can see that he is committed to utilitarianism in this work on liberty, which is confusing to a certain extent, because when you hear the phrase on liberty and you see a defense of freedom of expression and freedom of experiments in living that he defends in section 3, and basically setting limits to government authority, this all sounds very much like a modern-day libertarian. And modern-day libertarians are very much believers in rights. They sound a lot more like Locke, that we have natural rights. Locke doesn't actually use this language, but people have interpreted Locke as being a rights theorist. That is, that each individual naturally has certain rights to life, liberty, property, and they cannot be infringed for any reason. So, for example, if you believe that, then it makes sense to say that no matter what the benefit to society for censoring certain things, like think of, fake news, fakes on social media. Should we censor them? The libertarian view is no, we shouldn't. You cannot censor those things, no matter what the benefit to society. So even if people say, but look, all of those fakes are polluting public discourse, people believe that Democrats are controlling hurricanes, and that, that all of these, Jewish space lasers, those kind of things, that's all bullshit, but people are believing it, and it's affecting our elections and things like that. Surely it's bad for society. A libertarian could say, doesn't matter if it's bad for society, that's irrelevant. If you have a right to say things that aren't true, it is inviolable, and you cannot be stopped from doing that, even if it's for the good of society. So that's the sort of modern rights-based libertarian view. But that's not Mill's view. Mill believes in utilitarianism, and he makes it clear right after he's introduced the simple principle, which is the number one thing that people quote from On Liberty, that we'll get to in a second. He says, my principle is not based on right. It's not based on this idea that there are inalienable rights that cannot be infringed for whatever reason. Instead, he says his principle is based on utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. This is on page... The version of On Liberty that I'm referring to and that I had you read is this abridged version that I found online. I don't know who abridged it. That comes out as 32 pages. It cuts out quite a lot. There are some, I think, important passages that it removes, and also it kind of muddles some of the argument. So it's not clear. He goes through stages of argument in that sort of cut in this version. However, Mill is very much a Victorian writer, and reading Mill, I think Mill is a great writer, but like Hume, reading Mill can be torturous, and his sentences can stretch on for entire pages, it seems. So reading the whole of On Liberty can be an exhausting process, even though enriching as well, I would say. So I thought an abridged version would be good. Anyway, the abridged version, page 4, where he's talking about the, is it page 4? Liberty in the utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. This is his version of utilitarianism, and all of the phrases are important. So, permanent interests of man, that is sort of almost like a species, as a progressive being. And so what he's arguing is that humans are not a finished work. And this is actually a theme in Mill that we can see the beginnings of in Rousseau. That is, that humans are shaped by their institutions. And so that it's very important that our institutions be set up in the right way, because our institutions are going to be making people. And if our institutions are corrupted or imperfect, they will produce imperfect humans, humans that do not thrive and flourish as humans should. This is very clear in Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality, when he paints sort of humans in modern-day humans as corrupted versions of what started out so promising in savage humans who sort of roamed around centuries before. Nowadays, humans are made into these sort of these creatures that are riddled with envy and amour propre and all that stuff. Mill very much takes this on board. It's not the case that there tends to be an assumption, and certainly an assumption by libertarians, that humans are humans, and that it's a one-way process. Humans make their institutions, not the other way around. What Rousseau pointed out is it is the other way around as well, that humans, what humans are like in any particular age is a product of their institutions. So we want the institutions to be the right ones so that the humans are optimized. And that's part of the big idea of On Liberty, that too much interference by institutions will cramp and constrict human development. And in fact, in section 3, this is very clear, that one of the reasons why humans should be left alone as much as possible to find out what kind of life suits them is that's the way that humankind is going to progress. That's the way that we're going to develop into the best humans that we can be. So it is a consequentialist justification for what sounds like defense of individual rights. But he very clearly says, I'm not going to claim that people have rights. In this, he is influenced by Bentham, who famously said that the idea that we have rights. What are these things, rights? Where are they written down? Where are they encoded in human DNA? They're just an invention. Bentham referred to rights as nonsense, and the idea of inalienable rights as nonsense on stilts, which is a wonderful phrase. So, Mill is a consequentialist, that all of the justification for the claims for the policies he lays down here has to be utilitarian in his specific sense. All right, let's go through the sections. First section, introductory, where he's laying out the sort of history of the relationship between the notion of liberty and authority, the sort of struggle, the titanic struggle between the freedom of individuals and the authority of their governments. And historically, he says, originally, we've had this idea that the liberty of the subjects was inversely proportional to the authority of the king. So if the king sort of left his subjects alone, then they had a great amount of liberty. If the king decided to meddle with his subjects' affairs, then their liberty was constricted. So in order to increase liberty, the subjects over the course of history tried to bring about some restrictions, some checks on the king's authority. Probably Mill is thinking here of the Magna Carta, is the first time that the aristocracy got a document that the king had signed that restricted the king's authority. And this was an expanse on English liberty, you might say. But then there was a second stage that is actually exemplified most clearly in Rousseau's Social Contract, where it's argued that instead of there being the monarch and the subjects, the idea is that the sovereign is the people. This is the idea of the general will in Rousseau's Social Contract. And Rousseau says all kinds of things here. Actually, Hobbes says some things like this too, that when the people are the sovereign, then the sovereign you cannot think of this as an adversarial relationship. So actually Hobbes and Rousseau both say that you can't complain at anything the sovereign does because the sovereign is you. So the sovereign acting is you acting. So whatever the sovereign does is sort of a realization of your freedom. And of course, the most notorious instance of this in Rousseau is where he uses the phrase, where you disagree with the general will, the general will is allowed to compel you to comply, and you can't complain because this is just you being forced to be free, because of freedom is doing what the general will says. And so that sort of movement replaced this idea that you needed checks on the power of the sovereign, and that was what liberty was. No, 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 says people like Rousseau. Liberty is being part of the general will. But what Mill points out is no, this is just propaganda, because this just allows for tyranny of the majority. Because really, the general will is just the will of the majority, and the majority can constrict the liberty of the minority. And in particular, Mill is very concerned with something called social tyranny. He says even if the laws don't compel you to not do certain things that you want to do, if the customs and the general, common sense ideas of your culture restrict you, as for example, if, this generation, even in this generation, if a high school boy wanted to just wear a dress to school, why? Because he liked the dress. There would be enormous pressure against this, not just in being teased by his schoolmates, but also the teachers would get anxious about it and they would restrict it. That's an example of social tyranny. It's stopping him from doing something that he wants to do. And Mill wants to talk about limits being placed on things like that. So he's sort of advocating a return to the original idea that liberty is your sort of sphere within which you cannot be told what to do. Just as originally liberty was checks on the king's authority, now liberty is checks on the authority of the majority, of society. And he says that in this introductory section, he says we're going to talk about three regions of human liberty. Thought and discussion, which he discusses in section 2. Tastes and pursuits, which he discusses in section 3. And uniting with others, which comes up a couple of times in sections 4 and 5. All right, the simple principle. This is on page 4. This is the most famous thing that is always quoted from On Liberty, and it's sometimes called the harm principle. But what you have to know is that this simple principle is not the whole story. You can't just say, I've got all I need to from On Liberty by looking at this principle. Okay, great. That's the point of it. Everything else is just padding. No, because exactly how to interpret it and put it into practice and discussion of hard cases is the point of the rest of it. So I think Mill is hard to read because he doesn't sort of lay things out with bullet points. It's sort of the opposite of that. It's all a very subtle discussion of cases, and he doesn't bring you back to his principle and say, now look at what the discussion of this case means for my original principle. That's left up to you to work out. But sort of the first statement of the principle, which will then get qualified in various ways throughout the rest of the essay, is this. The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number, is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so. This is paternalism. This idea that people can be forced to do what is good for them is called paternalism. And where it gets discussed nowadays, probably the most in philosophy, is in bioethics and medical ethics, because doctors are just the prime paternalists. They tell you, look, you've got to go through this chemotherapy or you'll die. And there's a big debate, can doctors force their patients to do things that will be good for them because the doctors know better, or should the patients be allowed the freedom to refuse treatment, even if it's for bad reasons? That's a sort of balance that we see playing out, where Mill's ideas really, the rubber hits the road. But what he's saying here is the government cannot force you to do things for your own good. The only reason it can force you to do something is if what you're doing is harming other people. Now, this sounds like a simple principle. I mean, he calls it a simple principle. But what does that mean, harming other people? Because, and you can see why he talks about gambling and drunkenness. Because if a father gambles, he's going to defend himself as, hey, it's my business, I earn this money, I get to gamble it, it's just my vice, it's what makes me happy. But of course, in so doing, he bankrupts himself and he affects his family. So where does that fall? He's going to argue, you can't interfere with me for my own good. You can't say, no, we're going to ban gambling because it's harmful to you. He says, you can't do that. It's up to me. I'm allowed to harm myself. But on the other hand, his wife and children are going to say, but it's harming us too, because he's our means of support, certainly in Victorian times. And we're being thrown out on the street because he gambled all the money away. So how do we balance this out? And that's the point of the rest of the discussion. An interesting quote that is omitted from your version is this one, where he qualifies the application of this principle. He says, of course, this principle only applies to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. This is on page 4 in this version. It doesn't apply to children. So you are allowed to be paternalistic to children. Obviously, it's called paternalism because you're acting like a parent. Paternalism only sounds negative is when society is acting like a parent to an adult. But an actual parent acting like a parent to the actual child, that's allowed and that's legitimate, because children are not capable and shouldn't be thought of as being able to look after their own interests. So yes, it's obvious that this principle doesn't apply to children. But what Mill goes on to say is it doesn't apply to either to those backward states of society. Now, Mill, while he was, for his time, incredibly progressive, and he wrote a feminist work called On the Subjection of Women. He's not advocating for it, he's saying that they experience it. So he is like as far progressive as you could get for his age. Some of the things he says would definitely get him cancelled today, because one of the quote that has been cut from this version is, he says, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting the end. What he's saying is some people, some cultures are not capable. They're like, the people of this culture are all like children. They are insufficiently civilized to be left alone to do experiments in living. They will just destroy themselves. This sounds very much like, the white man's burden, as it was called by Kipling. The principle that justified the British Empire. Oh, we're doing the world good because we're going out and there's all these savages that need civilizing, and we're teaching them how to play cricket and, showing them the correct way of brewing tea, that kind of thing. And this smacks a little of that. But it's very consistent with his consequentialist justification, because his justification for this principle is, the point of this principle is to achieve a good end. If there are people where applying this principle will not achieve that good end because they can't handle the freedom, then don't apply the principle. So it's not saying everybody has rights no matter what. He's saying we should follow this principle because it has good effects, and where it doesn't have good effects, the principle does not apply. All right, so let's look at probably the most famous discussion, which is section 2, thought and discussion. So remember, this is a region of where liberty applies. So that's the spirit in which he's discussing it, as just one of the places in which we need to consider protection of the freedom of the individual. And then the question arises, well, why? And what if it's dangerous? What if, so, you know, there's all these discussions in censorship about what if you're disseminating bomb-making instructions? What if you're just lying about, you know, the Democrats controlling the weather or whatever? What if it's pornography? Like, what if you're distributing child pornography? Or, you know, obviously there's a reason to prohibit child pornography because of the children getting hurt. But what if they're deep fake child pornography? No actual humans were involved in this, but it looks like very disturbing sexual activity involving minors. Why should we protect speech like that? This is the discussion that he goes into. So he talks about, he breaks down basically reasons not to censor according to the first one. He says, imagine that your reason for censoring is not about the truth of the thing that you're censoring. So you're assuming that you're infallible. But what if it's true? What if the thing that you want to censor turns out to be the truth, and in censoring it, you're preventing the truth coming out? What's wrong about this, he says, is that you're claiming infallibility. You're claiming that you know what is the truth. Any censor is saying, I know what's true and what isn't. That's not the truth, so the public doesn't need to hear about it. But what if it is true? Now, he considers objections to his defense. So the first objection is, we're not claiming infallibility, we're just doing the best that we can. And in response to that, he says, for example, it says, there is no such thing as absolute certainty, but there is assurance sufficient for the purposes of human life. In other words, you can imagine someone responding to Mill saying, look, we're not claiming we're infallible, but, you know, surely there are some occasions where you're pretty damn sure that this is wrong or that it's bad if this comes out. And he says, Mill's response to this is, look, there's a value, and this actually is expanded more in the second section on what if it's false. There's a value in being exposed to alternatives. As he says on page 8, wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument, but facts and arguments to produce any effect on the mind must be brought before it. In the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so? So in other words, think of the people who you regard as experts, who presumably would be the ones you would want acting as censors. How has that judgment become so? Because he has kept his mind open to criticisms of his opinions and conduct. And on page 9, he says, if even the Newtonian philosophy, so he's writing this before Einstein, of course, and he's talking about, it's generally assumed that Newton's laws are absolutely right, and that Newton was a genius who uncovered this eternal truth about the universe. If even the Newtonian principle were not permitted to be questioned, mankind could not feel as complete assurance in its truth as it do now. Prophetic words, because he's writing this when it was thought that Newton had the whole truth. And then only a few decades later, along comes Einstein and relativity and challenges Newton and proves that Newton is not the entire truth. Now, one suggestion that a respondent to this will say, look, the truth will come out eventually anyway. And they say things like, they draw analogies with Christianity. So this is omitted in your reading, but here's what he says. So this is in the voice of Hume's critics. The persecutors of Christianity were in the right, that persecution is an ordeal through which truth ought to pass, and always passes successfully, legal penalties being in the end powerless against the truth. So that's the suggestion. And Mill's response quite obviously is, well, that's not fair on the people being persecuted, and also it's not even true. As he says, the Reformation broke out at least 20 times before Luther and was put down. So it's all very well smugly saying, look, the truth comes out. And he's imagining this in the voice of a Christian, a Protestant Christian, who says, look, Martin Luther told the truth and brought about Protestantism, and it couldn't be kept down with all the might of the Catholic Church, couldn't keep it down. And Mill says, you're forgetting that it did successfully keep it down for probably 1,000 years. So it's kind of a dumb argument. More interesting is his argument for suppose that the thing being censored is false. So so you can't claim, therefore, in the defense of this thing that it could be a bit of the truth. Let's assume that it's actually false. Well, then it sounds like, well, what's the harm in censoring it? Well, says Mill, there's a couple of important harms. And this is where we tie back to the idea of utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. So there is a value to humans of being exposed to falsehoods. Specifically, without being exposed to falsehoods, the truth becomes a dead dogma. This is his famous phrase, dead dogma. So, for example, and actually the long-term implications of this is people no longer really value them. And you can actually see something like this with going on with the protections of the American Constitution and with the value of democracy. We're going through a time in history where the value of democracy is actually being questioned. And what Mill would say is the reason why this has happened is because people have forgotten why democracy was valuable, because they haven't been taught about what the alternative was. So, for example, you see people saying, as the World War II generation dies off, these are the people who fought against fascism, and people are now forgetting what fascism was like and saying, oh, we're so used to peace and stability over our entire lifetimes and the lifetimes of our parents that we can't even imagine the alternative, which is fascism breaking out worldwide. Whereas the World War II generation absolutely valued democracy and the rule of law and things like that because they'd been exposed to the alternative. So the value of democracy became a dead dogma because people weren't exposed to the views, the alternative views. At least that's his suggestion. And also, you need, so there's sort of 2 points here. The first one is, if you don't know the alternatives to your view, you don't really know your view. as he puts it, he who knows only his own side knows little of that. This is on page 12, where he talks about Cicero, or Cicero, as I believe you're supposed to say, who is a great Roman orator and is famously knew his opponent's case and the reasons for his opponent's case as well as his own. And in doing so, he really understood his case. So Mill, of course, could say to a Christian, why do you believe your values? And if a Christian has only been taught Christianity to protect them from falsehoods, they don't really understand their values. Mill is not a Christian, but certainly believes in the teachings of Jesus. He is probably an example of something I had a colleague describe himself as, which is a Christian atheist. That is someone who thinks that Jesus was a great guy and said some absolutely great things, but wasn't the Son of God. He was just some guy who said some great things. So, you know, if you think of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the meek, that kind of thing, why are the meek blessed? Mill would want to say. And if you just say, I don't know, I've just been taught that they are, then you don't really get the truth. The truth is not vivid to you. You need to be able to be aware of the alternative. And Mill cites a famous Catholic notion, which is the devil's advocate. When somebody is training to become a priest, there is somebody called a devil's advocate who challenges every teaching that the priest is supposed to give by giving the opposite side, the devil's point of view, as it were. And unless the priest can give a good rebuttal to each of the devil's claims, the priest is not ready. The priest doesn't really get it. And Mill is saying that's the value of the falsehood. You need to be exposed to falsehood to be a sort of devil's advocate. Now, I think in our day and age of misinformation, we might not be so sanguine that the truth will win out. Perhaps Mill would say, well, then maybe we're still in a backward state. And if people are genuinely believing that Democrats are controlling the weather, so that there are stories of armed militia roaming North Carolina, hunting down FEMA agents because they believe that FEMA are doing all kinds of terrible things instead of trying to help people. Maybe these people are barbarians and they require despotism because they're not ready for, you know, the internet. They're not ready for all the falsehoods out there. They haven't got a developed, because your faculties can only be improved by being exposed to the falsehoods if you are capable of recognizing them as false. If instead you just accept the falsehoods and then you shut out the truth, something terrible has gone wrong. Now, the third defense of free speech or opposition to censorship is, he says, what if there's a bit of both the truth and falsity? And here he gives an analogy in politics where he says it's important that we have a party of progress, progressives, you know, in America it would be seen as the Democrats, or at least, you know, most of the Democrats, and then a party of stability, as he put it. Party of order of stability, that would be conservatives, that would be, in America's case, the Republicans. In Britain, it's the Tories, they're literally called the Conservatives. And a party of progress or reform, that's the Labour Party in England, Democrats, the closest thing in the United States. He says it's good to have those. They're both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. The opposition of the other that keeps each within the limits of reason and sanity. Further on, truth in the great practical concerns of life is so much a question of reconciling and combining of opposites. This is on page 13. Cut out from your version is a good quote about our friend Rousseau. He says, with what a salutary shock did the paradoxes of Rousseau explode like bombshells in the midst of, in Rousseau's time, of course, was the peak of the Renaissance and talking about the values of civilization. And of course, Rousseau comes along and says, no, civilization is crap. Savage man, much better off than what you call civilized. So that's what Mill means by the paradoxes of Rousseau, the praising of savagery, as it were. He goes on to say, with what a salutary shock did the paradoxes of Rousseau explode like bombshells in the midst, dislocating the compact mass of one-sided opinion and forcing its elements to recombine in a better form and with additional ingredients. Not that the current opinions were on the whole farther from the truth than Rousseau's were. On the contrary, they were nearer to it. So he believed that the standard view of people like Voltaire praising civilization was actually closer to the real truth than Rousseau's. But it was sort of smug and self-satisfied and didn't really examine closely, wasn't forced to examine its assumptions closely enough until Rousseau came along. Nevertheless, there lay in Rousseau's doctrine, and has floated down the stream of opinion with it, a considerable amount of exactly these truths which the popular opinion wanted. And these are the deposit which was left behind them when the flood subsided. So that's an example of where the value of Rousseau, even if most of what he said wasn't true, which is Mill's view, it's still, there was nuggets of truth in it that had gone ignored by the majority view, and by the sort of clash of the two, the majority view had to concede some of his points. It could rebut the others. But there's this whole value of discourse. There's a value of discourse not just in achieving the truth, but in enriching the people who argue. Being exposed to argument enlivens the mind. So that's when he gets to discussing education, he's very much in favor of the Socratic method, which is a sort of question and answer where it's not learning by rote. Learning by rote is a terrible system of education for Mill, because then you're just a parrot. You're just spouting out things without understanding them. The only way to achieve understanding of the truth is to show why it's the truth, and to prove that you understand that, you have to be able to rebut an alternative. And to be able to do that, you have to be exposed to an alternative. All right, individuality. Here he uses this phrase, experiments in living. Now, he does say that they can be restricted by government more than thought and discussion. Thought and discussion obviously doesn't hurt people. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Whereas experiments in living are you're actually acting. You're doing things in the world that are more likely to affect others. And he gives the example of famously there were riots over something called the Corn Law in 19th century England because people were mobs gathered and advocated that these corn laws would impoverish people, and it led to huge riots. So he says, speaking out against the corn laws is perfectly okay. That's thought and discretion. But doing it in the context of a mob, not so great. This is a bit like the famous restriction to the First Amendment. You're allowed, the First Amendment to the US Constitution defends freedom of speech, among other things. But one of the things that it does not defend is shouting fire in a crowded theater. So you can't argue that that's freedom of speech, and you should be able to stand up in a crowded theater and shout fire because of the immediate effect it will have of causing people to stampede for the exits and probably get injured. So you are allowed to restrict experiments in living more likely. What are experiments in living? Now, the full title of this chapter is Individuality as one of the elements of well-being. Again, well-being ties it back to utility. That is, he's arguing that living an individualistic life. He goes on to wax rhapsodically about eccentricity. You know, the crazy person in your neighborhood is doing it right because they are not just mimicking others. Mimicking others, in other words, if you do things because they're what is done, like, you know, wearing jeans and t-shirts because everybody else wears them, and not wearing a kilt or something like that. You know, having the same haircut. I noticed in my class the other day that all but one of the young women had long hair. Only one of them had short hair, but about one of the young men had short hair. Today, in 2024, we are still very much hidebound and rigid in our behaviors. That's bad. Why? Because, as he says, the only faculty that mimicry sort of develops is that of ape-like imitation. And the phrase ape-like indicates that this is not a true human life. And the point of this is to develop humankind. All of this is supposed to make us a better being. Yes, this is on page 16. He says, "He who lets the world or his own portion of it choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. He who chooses his plan for himself employs all his faculties. He must use observation to see, reasoning and judgment to foresee, activity to gather materials for decision, discrimination to decide, and when he has decided, firmness and self-control to hold to his deliberate decision." So now, why shouldn't we just follow others? Well, their experience might be too narrow. So why shouldn't I just find somebody who I think has lived their life successfully? Why can't I model my life on some idol? So I think that, oh, that person really did it right. You know, like Gandhi or something. Well, their experience might be too narrow. They might have interpreted their experience wrongly. They might have got the wrong lesson from their own experience. So don't necessarily listen to their analysis of their experience. You know, like all these people who write books of, I've discovered the secret of life while hiking through the Pyrenees or something, and here's the secret. Well, they might have just misunderstood it. There's a story, a short story I read when I was a kid that stuck with me, which is where there's a bored young nobleman in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, who's out in the middle of the country and just stuck in this big old house, and it's winter and it's cold. So he starts playing Russian roulette, and he's playing it with a revolver that only has two two holes for the bullets. He puts one bullet in, spins it, holds it to his head, and click, and it doesn't shoot him. And he keeps doing this, and so he spins it, puts it to his head, click, doesn't shoot him. So he interprets this as, wow, I'm blessed. I'm sort of invulnerable. I can do anything. And he goes out to conquer the world, and it says it was a particularly cold winter, so the wolves were starving, and they fell upon him almost instantly and killed and ate him. And what was happening is he had a very well-oiled and perfectly weighted revolver, so that means when he span it, the weight of the bullet kept the bullet one on the bottom, so the hammer was falling on the empty chamber, and that's why he never shot himself. It said if he'd held it upside down, he would have shot himself every time. So he took the wrong lesson from his experience. Their experience might be inapplicable to me. sure, maybe that was the right lesson for their life, but they're not necessarily. I might be different. I might be lactose intolerant, so I shouldn't go on a cheese tour of France or whatever. And then finally, the mimicry fails to develop key human faculties. And he gives the analogy of the tree. That is that this is also on page 16 in the same passage. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing. There's a discussion of nationhood, like entire nations can lose their individuality and stop progressing. And his interpretation is China has stopped this. He said China used to be amazing. It used to have it had a golden age where it was ahead of everywhere else in the world. But then it got trapped, where it fell into this trap of deciding that it was doing things the right way, and therefore it had to keep doing things the right way. So people are educated in China not to change. They've got to keep their culture the same. So they get trapped in amber, as it were. Whereas he says currently Europe is not like that. Although he says it's even happening in France and England to a certain extent. We need more originality. We need more eccentrics. Chapter 4, or section 4, part 4. He says, the limits of authority to the authority of society over the individual. You might say, well, why do you need this when you've got the simple principle? That has laid it out. That says that the limits to authority are the only time that authority can interfere is where the person is going to harm somebody else, but you're not allowed to interfere for the good of that person. Well, this is where he's teasing it out exactly what it means. What is the borderline between harming yourself and harming others? A clear distinction is the difference between being drunk and being drunk on duty. So what he's stressing in here is, you might say he's sort of, it sounds like he's backtracking a little on what sounds like a robust defense of individuality, because here he's stressing exactly the extent to which you do owe things to society, and therefore society is allowed to encroach on your liberty to certain extents. It doesn't mean that he's given up on this principle. He's just explaining the extent to which you're embedded in society and you owe something to society. And actually, there's an interesting passage here where he outright says, society, I've already read that, bottom of page 19, though society is not founded on a contract, and though no good purpose is answered by inventing a contract in order to deduce social obligation from it, despite that, everyone who receives the protection of society owes a return for the benefit. So you do owe something to society. The fact of living in society renders it indispensable that each should be bound to observe a certain line of contact towards the rest. So you can't say I am totally isolated from society. No, you're embedded in society. You get things from society. I mean, think of the roads. You get to drive around on roads because society has provided roads. Because you get that benefit, you owe something back to society. What do you owe? This conduct consists, first, in not injuring the interests of one another, or rather certain interests, which either by express legal provision or by tacit understanding ought to be considered rights. So he's allowing for a certain concept of rights, but it's not rights as some kind of abstract idea that are natural. We're just going to say there are such things as rights to the extent that they can be justified by utilitarianism. And secondly, in each person's bearing his share of the labors and sacrifices incurred. So you've got to bear your share, and if you're not, then society can force you to bear your share. In the same way as if you're on a lifeboat, you can't eat all the food and not fish. You have to do your part. So the discussion of the cases. He talks about if you are just drunk, society can't stop you. You're allowed to get drunk. Society can't just say being drunk is a terrible thing. For example, there's basically prohibition in Maine at the time, and he discusses it in section 5, where he says fermented drink is banned. He says you can't do that. If people want to drink alcohol and just sit there drunk, that's their business, and you're not allowed to interfere. However, a sentry who is drunk on duty, they're allowed to be punished to the extent that it interferes with their duty. So they're not being punished for being drunk. They're being punished for not adequately doing their duty. The discussion of the religious bigot, there's somebody who thinks that their values should be inflicted on others. A religious bigot, when charged with disregarding the religious feelings of others, has been known to retort that they disregard his feelings. Have you heard this? Like, for example, laws against gay marriage. That would be exactly the kind of thing that Mill would say you can't do. As he puts it, the religious bigot has said that the other people are disregarding his feelings by persisting in their abominable worship or creed. But there is no parity between the feeling of a person for his own opinion, the person who wants to marry someone of the same sex, and the feeling of another who is offended by his holding it. So screw the Karen, as it were. The religious bigot is the Karen of the day. Then we have the discussion of alcohol. He does allow, and also in this section, that certain restrictions on alcohol can be made. For example, you can only allow certain people to sell alcohol who can be relied on to make sure that the sale of alcohol doesn't lead to a riot that will affect everybody else. So you have to be reputable to be able to sell alcohol. He will allow that much. So he's not saying, it sounds like Mill can be read as someone who's saying no restrictions, like hard drugs should be legalized. Now, he doesn't actually discuss things like opium, which were around then. There were actually opium dens. He discusses alcohol, and what he says about alcohol is kind of nuanced. He says that you can't ban the sale of it outright because people want to drink it, and it's perfectly okay. People are allowed to cause harm to themselves as an experiment. But what they're not allowed to do is affect others adversely. And then his discussion of Mormonism, where he says people are offended by polygamy. He says, yeah, I think polygamy is uncivilized, but you're not allowed. So this is where he doesn't sound like a British Empire kind of person. A recent writer, in some respects of considerable merit, proposes, to use his own words, not a crusade against the Mormons, but a civilizade against this polygamous community, to put an end to what seems to him a retrograde step in civilization. These people are going back to the past, practicing polygamy. We need to stop that. It also appears to me, Mill is saying, yes, I think this is kind of backwards, but I am not aware that any community has a right to force another to be civilized. So that doesn't sound like a British Empire kind of person. There's a lot of interesting examples there of the gambler affecting his family and the extent to which he can be stopped from gambling. So there's good discussions here, and also that continues in chapter 5 applications. Now, what's interesting here is he begins chapter 5 by saying, two maxims together form the entire doctrine of this essay. That's funny, because didn't he say it was one simple principle? So the two maxims are that the individual is not accountable to society for his actions insofar as those concern the interests of no person but himself. And secondly, that for such actions that are prejudiced to the interests of others, the individual is accountable and may be subjected either to social, which is sort of, cultural pressures, where people can gather around and say, no, you can't do that, or to legal punishments. Literally, laws can be passed if society is of opinion that the one or the other is requisite for its protection. So this is where he basically puts both sides. The individual's point of view is the first maxim, the society's point of view is the other. And here he goes through discussing the balances of one against the other. Trade, he's in favor of free trade. He doesn't say that, for example, price fixing should be allowed for the good of society. So it sounds like he might be opposed to things like tariffs, like what Trump is proposing, protectionism. That's often presented as good for society. But what he would argue is, well, whether or not it's good for society is an open question. And if it turns out that free trade is actually better for society, then there goes that justification. So you can't just say that you're doing it for the good of society. It has to be really evident. And besides, it should be the case that the freedom of the customer should be paramount. Then there's crime prevention or accident. Here's a famous example on page 26. He says, if either a public officer or anyone else saw a person attempting to cross a bridge which had been ascertained to be unsafe, and there was no time to warn him of his danger, they might seize him and turn him back. Well, doesn't that sound like doing things for his own good? Well, here's what he says. Liberty consists in doing what one desires, and he does not desire to fall into the river. That sounds a little bit slippery of Mill there, because it looks like you could, if you get into desires, there's a distinction to be made between what people actually desire, which may not be for their own good, and what their ideal desires, which is what he sounds like he's talking about. Because it might literally be true that someone might desire to fall into the river because they're crazy or because they're stupid. Now you say they shouldn't desire, but that's not the same thing. So that's kind of an interesting case where you are allowed to intervene and stop someone doing what they apparently want to do in a way that seems to be to their own good. Now, crime prevention, he says, if you see anyone evidently preparing to commit a crime, police are not bound to look on inactive until the crime is committed. As you might think, you might say, well, suppose I'm sitting there, I'm allowed to plan a crime. I'm not doing anything. Isn't that covered by thought and discussion, me planning a crime? And he says, well, no, if it looks like you're right on the edge of doing it, then we don't have to wait for you to, society doesn't have to wait for you to actually kill somebody, because then it's too late to save them. So in the interest of saving them, we can stop you. Again, this brings up issues of, well, what counts? Think of the plot to kidnap Governor Whitner. On the one hand, they were clearly plotting, but on the other hand, they were kind of buffoons. So should they really face serious consequences for just stupidly discussing kidnapping the governor? It seems like he sides with you'd had to get into, well, were they really going to be able to carry it out? Then we get into, on page 28, a discussion of paternalism, where it talks about drunkenness. You're not allowed to be paternalistic. You're not allowed to do... oh yes, this is a discussion of, can you institute a sin tax? In other words, drunkenness is bad for people, so can you at least tax it to the extent that makes it too expensive? On the one hand, he says no, but on the other, he does say, but then by the end of the passage, he says, taxation of stimulants up to the point which produces the largest amount of revenue, supposing the state needs all the revenue which it yields, is not only admissible, but to be approved of. So it sounds like you can tax things like alcohol. And maybe firearms and things like that. Maybe you could tax bullets, because using bullets is bad for society in the same way that drunkenness is. Because, of course, there's no absolute right to bear arms, according to Mill. Contracts are one of the cases of uniting with others that he talked here. What kind of contracts can be enforced? Where he says you can't enforce a contract of somebody contracting into slavery. And here he makes a point that Rousseau actually makes as well. By selling himself as a slave, he abdicates his liberty. He foregoes any future liberty. So you can't protect someone's liberty to contract into slavery. It's contradictory. What's the justification for respecting his wishes? Respecting his freedom. But if his wishes are to become a slave, that will destroy his freedom. So it's self-contradictory, and you can't enforce a contract to slavery. Now, you can enforce all other kinds of contracts, even ones disadvantageous to individuals, including into drudgery. So we can enforce a contract where we would say, you really shouldn't sign that contract, in respecting his freedom to sign a contract that's bad for him, because we're not paternalistic. Then there's discussion of education. Education, if somebody can't supply education for its child, the state must supply it. So notice that unlike standard modern-day libertarians who are opposed to taxation, Mill is totally okay with taxation, and in fact okay with a fairly extensive state that can provide education for those that cannot provide it for their children, and to enable people to live experiments in living. In order to experiment in living, you have to have education, you have to have a social safety net. Because nobody can do experiments in living if they're poor. They have to work. So there has to be some kind of social safety net that allows people to experiment. I heard the drummer for the Police, whose name, Stuart Copeland, who is American but went to England to found the Police. And he said that the dole in England, unemployment, which you're entitled to without ever having worked, he said that's the reason that so many great bands came out of England, because nobody had to get a job. They could go on the dole. It doesn't pay much, but it paid enough to live on, so that you could practice your band as a teenager and you didn't have to be working at McDonald's the whole time. And he said that's why there were so many great bands coming out of England, because of the dole. That's exactly the kind of thing that Mill sounds amenable to. Finally, reproduction. And here's where Mill definitely doesn't sound like a libertarian. He says there can be law. He nods in approval at laws against marriage for those who are unable to support their children. Now, I've heard plenty of people say this when they see, giant families of poor people where the kids barely have enough to eat. They say, well, they shouldn't be allowed to have children. But a libertarian would say one of the greatest interests that any human has is in reproducing, and that surely the government can't intrude on their reproduction. And here's Mill, the defender of liberty, saying it's okay to prohibit poor people getting married if you can't support your children. Now, of course, this is in the context of a welfare state. So presumably it wouldn't just affect poor people. It would affect people who are rash or who have gambled away all their money. So he would definitely not want it to be the case that it affects people who are poor through no fault of their own. It prevents them from having children. But so it might prevent them from having large families. So whereas at the beginning it sounds like Mill is sort of unabashedly on the side of the individual and sounds like a libertarian, by the time you get to the final two sections, his conception that we are all products of our society and we have to contribute to it as well has certainly qualified it, and it becomes two maxims, and the point of view of society is represented. But he finishes on a note that libertarians would certainly improve on, where he says, the most cogent reason for restricting the interference of government is the great evil of adding unnecessarily to its power. That is, we don't want to increase government bureaucracy. And actually, he speaks approvingly of Americans. He says, every body of Americans is able to, let them be left without a government, and every body of Americans is able to improvise one and carry on that or any other public business with a sufficient amount of intelligence, order, and decision. Really? But he does certainly make it clear that we don't want the government controlling the interests of individuals. And even education, he does sound a bit like someone who would favor charter schools, because he certainly wants it to be the case that there shouldn't be a single state education. There should be education that is diverse. But remember, a lot of charter schools are set up to be religious schools. And remember his discussion of the religious bigot. You can't have schools just teaching one side of it. So it's kind of an odd balance. But there you go. Mill, the first hippie.